Hello, my name is Ron Woodland. I'm in charge of user education here at Strata. In this video, we'll be introducing you to the interface of Studio Pro. We'll also take you through a project in which you will model objects, create and apply textures, script an animation, and even use some special effects. Let's get right to it, shall we? First, let's look at the menu bar. As we go across the top of the screen, we'll see the standard distribution of menus across that bar. The File menu, which has the standard document management commands, as well as the Quit command at the bottom. The Edit menu, copy, cut, and paste, of course, duplicate, replicate, and at the bottom of this menu is a Preferences command for controlling the global settings for the software. We have the Selection menu, special handling for selection of objects. This is especially useful in more complex models. The Modeling menu contains the different modeling commands for the grouping and ungrouping and transformation of objects, as well as the modeling extensions, which are stored in submenus at the bottom of the menu. The Animation menu contains, of course, commands which work with the animation palette, which we'll be showing you later. The Shapes command is used for controlling and managing shapes for hierarchical modeling. The Textures menu for controlling textures. And notice that the Textures palette at the bottom of the interface also has a representation of textures. The Rendering menu contains commands for setting up rendering options and rendering effects, as well as environment and lighting. And of course the Windows menu for management of the multiple windows that may be opened while working on a project. Okay, next, underneath the menu bar is the button bar, which contain buttons for engaging the more often used commands in Studio Pro. Here you can choose to use the 3D sculptor, the 2D sculptor, the sweep, lathe, and extrude modelers, skin, unskin, facet, smooth, locking, unlocking, grouping, as well as the change mapping button. On the left side of the interface is the tool palette. The top three buttons on the left side of the tool palette are the view management controls. The top three on the right are for object management. The next group of tools are the 3D primitives. These are tools that allow you to draw 3D objects in the model space. The next set of tools are the 2D drawing tools. As you can see right here, they draw 2D objects, either closed or open line. The next set are the local light sources, spotlight and point light. The next set, of course, are the linking and camera object tools. And then the final tool is the camera tool, or snapshot, or rendering tool. We move down to the lighting palette. This is where you can set the direction and number of directional light sources. You can click and drag on these objects here in the lighting palette and position them so that they shine on the model from different directions. You can edit, add new light sources, or delete light sources from this palette. The Textures palette also doubles as a Shapes palette by clicking on the button at the bottom of the palette. The Textures palette contains previews of each of the textures that are present in the Textures folder within Strata Studio Pro's application folder. If there are more previews than can fit on the Textures palette, you can scroll horizontally to see other textures. The same applies to the Shapes palette. These are shapes that are present in the Shapes folder within the Studio Pro application folder at startup time. And these objects may be used when you assemble a scene. For example, if we scroll to the orange and select it, we'll see that the name of that shape appears in the pop-up menu at the bottom of the Shapes palette. Let's insert this into the model document. We can do that by just dragging and dropping it into position. It automatically loads, and there we have our orange in the model with its textures and everything already applied. Now let's look at the model window itself. At the top of the model window, there are 3 buttons on the left side which indicate display method. We have wireframe, hidden line removed, and quick shaded. If we click on the hidden line removed, we can see that the rendering looks very much like wireframe, except that any of the surface that isn't visible is removed. Shaded gives us a sense of lighting and of surface and of color in a rough way so that we can work with our light sources easier. The next control is our lens control. We can choose orthographic, normal, or wide angle. It's recommended that you use orthographic for modeling and one of the perspective, normal or wide angle, for rendering. Further to the right, we also see a feedback area which will give us information about the work that we're doing, the cursor position, the settings of the lens and display methods, or any other information that's relevant. We also see the rulers, horizontal and vertical rulers, which indicate or correspond to the X and Y coordinates of the model space. Well, let's do some rendering of this orange. A couple of fun renderings. First, we'll choose Still Good from the Rendering Options pull-down menu, and that automatically chooses our camera tool. We drag a marquee around our orange, and we see that it renders very quickly, gives us a nice sense of the orange peel surface. It took us 9 seconds to render. We'll drag that over here. Now we'll move to the effects and choose watercolor, which uses the Ray Painter rendering method. That'll be discussed later in the video. We'll render that also. Notice that in this case, we're rendering a more artistic look. We'll move that over. And let's choose Stills Best. When we render with this, we'll be getting our render dialog, which comes up and lets us set up specific information and size for a rendering. We'll choose whatever we ended up with and choose to render now. This renders with the ray tracer. You notice that the ray tracer and the Phong renderer look a lot alike in this case. It isn't necessary to always use the ray tracer. That's something I'd like to stress. The Phong renderer is a real workhorse, and we'll be using it a lot later in the video. Well, let's close these out and move on to a project. We'll delete our orange here so that we can start with a clean document. We'll switch back to wireframe and also back to the textures palette at the bottom. In keeping with the fruit theme that we've developed here, let's do a project now where we create an apple, some leaves, and the stem, of course, make a texture for it, and put it in a scene where we script an animation of the apple falling off of a box. Let's get started. First thing we want to do for our project is to draw a sphere. We just put that in the middle of our model window, an appropriate, comfortable size. And so now we take that sphere and we move into what we call the 3D Sculptor Modeler. In the Sculptor Modeler, we see vertex points along or on the surface of the object so that we can manipulate those and change the geometry of the object. We pick our surface tool so that we can then pull and push vertex points in different ways on the surface. And notice how we're now distorting the sphere as we start to achieve the shape of an apple. We pull these points away from the surface to make the top of the apple bigger than the bottom. We get that general apple shape. And now we take the top of the apple and pull it down so that we create a dimple in the surface. Notice that we can move the handles, the direction handles of each vertex point to distort the surface and create or exaggerate the dimple effect that we're after. We do that to the top and bottom, and then we rotate our view so that we can look at it from a different place, a different orientation. And we continue to do that, and we're not interested, of course, in symmetry. We just want it to look real so that it has that look of an apple. And now we switch to the quick shaded view, and we rotate our view so that we get a sense of the shading of the object, and we pull a couple more points on the surface so that we can accentuate some of the imperfections that we would see in an apple. We could have been doing this all along, but it's just whatever you're comfortable with, wireframe or shaded or whatever. And we click OK, and we return back to the model. And our sphere now has, of course, all the geometry of the apple that we put together. We position that into our model, rotate it so that we're comfortable with it. And now we're going to apply a texture. We use a drag and drop feature that's in Studio Pro that allows us to load and apply a texture just by clicking and dragging its preview. We select Stills Good as our rendering method, and we choose the camera tool, and we render a preview of this object. We chose, of course, gold polished as our texture to see what this apple would look like as a metal gold object. Notice the reflections. It has a built-in environment reflection. Notice the highlights that we're picking up on the surface as you'd expect from a metal object. Notice the time estimate and the preview of the modeling window, the activity beach ball as it spins as we render. Okay, and here we have our golden apple right out of a fairy tale. Let's see what a stone apple would look like. We'll go back to our textures palette and we'll scroll horizontally until we come to a stone texture, and we'll drag and drop that texture onto our apple, and of course the stone texture is loaded and automatically applied and replaces the gold. And we render that. We can do this any way you want. You can choose brick, you can choose any texture you have in mind. We're doing this just to show you some of the possibilities. We haven't talked much about textures. This particular texture is mathematically derived. We call it a procedural texture. The gold texture was a surface texture which allowed us to have surface maps or pictures as our map. So here's our stone apple. And of course we want this apple to look real, so we need to add a few more things to it. We want to put some leaves and a stem. First thing we want to do is draw just a simple 2D rectangle for the leaf, but of course we'll go back to the 3D sculptor and we'll turn this into a leaf with some contours and some shape to it. So as we now pull some of the vertex points around, we'll start to generate the shape of a leaf. As you can see, we're scrunching up both sides of it and bending the edges of the square polygon, what used to be the square polygon, into a leaf shape. And notice that this is still just a 2D object. We've just been working on the outer edges of it. But now we're going to start to distort the surface itself. We'll place a vertex point right in the middle, and we'll choose our surface tool and we'll pull it upwards away from the flat surface. Now we take the rotate tool and we'll rotate this so that we look at it edge on. And we'll select a vertex point, the vertex point that we pulled upward, and we'll hinge this point using the Option key so that we put a crease down the middle of the leaf. And again, notice that this is happening on 3 dimensions so that we're getting, again, a closer look at the leaf. We switch now to wireframe so that we can select all of the points on each end, and we drag those down so that we accentuate the curvature of the leaf again. This looks pretty good. We like what we see. And so we click OK and we return back to the model. Now we're going to apply a texture to this object. We're going to use the same stone texture that we used before on the apple. After we apply it through the drag and drop method, we're going to edit this texture and turn it into a leaf texture. I hope you get the idea that you can do whatever you want here. This is fully flexible and you can choose anything you wish to do. We're going to choose a couple of different colors, a light and a dark green. And of course the stone texture, what used to be the stone texture, will give us a nice variations of lights and darks on the green, similar to what you'd see in a real leaf. Okay, so we change the name of the texture and we return back to the model. So we have our leaf with a green texture. Okay, now we want to select the rotate tool and we rotate the leaf into position, orienting it correctly with the apple, moving it into position. One of the things we want to do as part of this is to duplicate this leaf several times. We're going to hold down the Command key while we drag the object origin point to the center of the apple where the dimple is. And then we choose the rotate tool and hold down the Option key while we rotate the leaf. Notice that it leaves a duplicate or creates a duplicate, and we do that a couple of times. Remember, that's the Command key to move the origin point, the Option key to rotate and duplicate. Then we use the Scale tool to scale one of the leaves a little bit smaller so that there's some variation in the sizes of the leaves. Okay, now let's make a stem. We'll choose the Polyline tool, the Open Polyline tool. This allows you to put several straight lines together, and we'll create the outline of a stem, a template as it were, that we'll now lathe using the lathe modeler. We click on the button in the button bar. Notice that the template appears in the dialog, and we can move our lathe axis into position. And we change the lathe segments to 18, which is a recommended number, and click on the OK button, and the stem appears. We have now a stem that we can put into position, and we then want to apply a wood texture. We scroll sideways, horizontally along the textures palette until we find our wood texture. And we use the drag and drop method again. A very nice, handy way to do this. It loads the texture and applies it to the stem. Now remember, the texture on the apple is still the stone texture. We could use that, of course, but we really want to do a more realistic texture for the apple. We're going to create a new texture. So we click on the New button on the Textures palette, which brings up a Surface Texture dialog. First thing we do is increase the gloss setting. Then we go get the surface map that we want to use. We're going to use the apple skin texture, which you can find in the tutorial folder of your software. We'll do a quick preview right here just to check how the gloss setting looks on the apple skin. Looks pretty good to us. We'll give it a name, Apple Skin. And we click OK, and we return back to the model. The texture has been applied now to the apple. Because this is a surface map, we need to make some adjustments in the mapping, how this actually appears on the surface of the apple. We click on the Map button of the button bar, which opens the Change Mapping dialog. We can choose from different ways this object is mapped onto the surface. We choose spherical because, of course, it most closely resembles the geometry of the apple. And we adjust the surface scale so that we can make it look more appropriate to the size of this apple. We turn off the tiling temporarily so that we can get an idea of one iteration of the map on the surface. And we can render it right here in the Change Mapping dialog. You get a sense here of how big one of the map iterations appears on the surface. We like that. We like the scale, so we change to normal, which will now repeat that map across the entire surface of the apple, and we return back to the model. Now we're ready to render. We just need to pick our view position. We're going to choose the View Rotate tool and rotate our window around so that we can see it from a little more perspective and get a better sense of the apple. We choose Custom from the pull-down menu on the tool palette and set some of the rendering parameters. Here we're going to choose image quality smooth, which incorporates some anti-aliasing, so the edge of the object isn't jaggy. We now use the Phong renderer. Notice we're not using ray tracing, we're using Phong to do this rendering. Phong is a very usable tool, rendering method, a real workhorse. And as this begins to render, we'll turn off the screen feedback so it can render a little faster. While that's rendering, let's talk about the renderers that are available in Studio Pro. There are 9 different ways to render. They're all built in, no extra cost. We have wireframe, hidden line removed, quick shading, flat shading, Garot, Phong that we're using for this rendering, and of course ray tracing, radiosity, and ray painting, which we'll be showing you later. Now these are all discussed in Chapter 8 of the User's Manual. As you can see, the Phong renderer did a credible job. Quite realistic, don't you think? Let's use the new Ray Painter now to do some renderings. We go to the rendering options pull-down menu and choose watercolor from the effects. And we drag a marquee around the apple, only this time we're seeing some 3D brush techniques rather than photorealism. Notice how the Ray Painter renders line by line as it goes down the image. The Ray Painter is an exciting rendering method. It's a 3D brush that generates artistic effects rather than realistic effects like the other renderers. In this rendering method, you can choose a background texture, say of rag or linen or rice paper. You can choose a brush for hard chalk, watercolor, pointillist effects. You can choose brush size and brush gap, and these can be combined for any effect that you want. And here's our finished Ray painted apple. Notice the canvas texturing in the background as well. Now let's look at a little animation that was done with this apple using the dry brush. We'll open this animation and expand its window so that you can see it all. And we'll play that with the loop feature turned on in the animation. And you can see an interesting effect, the texturing on the apple as well as the brush strokes around the edges and the special effects that occur as those objects move. Speaking of movement, let's script an animation. Let's take this apple and create a scene that we can put an action on the apple and watch it move through the scene. The first thing we want to do is reset our view position so that we can look at it from the front again. Then we'll choose the magnify tool and we'll zoom out so that we can see more of the model space. Then we'll switch our textures palette to the shapes palette and we'll choose the steel cube. We'll drag and drop that cube into the model space. Notice how it just draws and positions itself as you need. Then we choose the cube tool and draw a ground plane. We switch to the textures palette and use the dark wood that we used on the stem of the apple for this ground plane. Next, we go to the Windows menu and open the animation palette. On this animation palette, we'll switch the frame rate to 24 frames per second with the pull-down menu. Then we'll take the time length pointer, the L-shaped icon on the timeline, and move it to 3.5 seconds. Now this establishes our scene for time 0, and we'll move our time pointer, the current time pointer, to the 0.5 second. And we'll move our apple to the edge of the steel cube and rotate it so it's falling precipitously off the edge of the cube. Notice we're going to adjust slightly to make the path look like it's going to fall. And then we're going to use one of the animation extensions called bounce. We're going to actually script the bouncing of this apple onto the ground plane below the steel cube. We set the distance to 3.75 inches and the time to 2.5 seconds, and we let this bounce animation extension calculate how this apple would bounce falling off the steel cube. Quite realistic. Now we want to put our time pointer at 2.5 seconds, which is the end of the bounce sequence, but we've decided now to put in a spotlight. We want to put in a spotlight that will shine on the apple as it bounces. So we choose the spotlight tool and we move back to our model window and we just click and insert a spotlight. Now there's several options on the spotlight. The only thing we need to change right here is the cone angle. We need a little narrower cone angle. And we'll click OK and return to the model. And we want this to point at the apple, and so we use another animation extension called Point At. And in the dialog, you have the choices of the different objects that are in the model. We're going to have the spotlight point at the apple. This extension will automatically calculate the animation of the spotlight, and you can see in the preview marquee that it follows the apple as it bounces off of the steel cube. Let's use another animation extension now at the end of the bounce sequence. Let's do something fun with it. We could use the atomize special effect, which would convert it into a bunch of little spheres, but now let's try the shatter. We think that would be fun, but maybe, how about explode? We'll take and shatter this object and explode it in one pass. And so we choose the explode animator. We can make some minor adjustments to the different settings there, but we could pretty well take it as it sits, the default settings. Okay, the explode will then occur at the 2.5 mark on the timeline, and as you can see, it's scripting the animation now, and then we'll have the rest of the animation sequence put into position. And now our animation is ready to render. For the sake of time, I've rendered this previously. Let's open that now and look at Apple Bounce Explode. We'll open this in Studio Pro. You'll get a chance to see the full rendered effects that we've generated. Wasn't that exciting? In a relatively short time, we were able to generate a rather sophisticated animation sequence. Now, in the course of this video, we've walked through the interface. We've modeled with 3D splines. We've created and applied several textures to objects. We've scripted an animation, and we've even used special effects. And now it's time for you to dive into the manual. Each of the chapters has several tutorials to help you retain the information that's presented there and what you've seen here on the video. Thank you for watching, and good modeling.